Okay, so let's keep talking about this idea called edge effects. So the edge of a territory or a community or a habitat or whatever we want to think about is going to experience different abiotic conditions than the interior. So when we're looking at conservation projects, and this will be really important when we get into conservation and restoration. So maybe make a little note, edge effects video on chapter 4. Let's revisit this. So you look at this and go, okay, if your species needs so much territory to survive, every species is going to have a territory requirement. How is a territory configured? So again, look at these two diagrams here. They both have a total area of 50 hectares. So same size, but this one down here, let's call it number 2 versus number 1, has a core area of 25 hectares. That's the darker green here. That means that darker green area will probably be, if this is forest, denser forest, bigger trees, more shade, less wind. All those factors change when you have this big core area because you have a smaller block, or it's configured in a block shape, versus the upper one where you have a lot of just small thin areas. You look at the distance from here to here, from here to here, this little, so you really have no core area in number 1 up here because it's all small, thin, stretched out. Even though somebody may argue, well, it's the same amount of territory, the territory configuration and the amount of edge effect plays a big role. So if you have a species that, again, think about in forests, the edge of the forest has lots of scrubby, brushy, viney plant life versus the interior of the forest where you get bigger trees that put a canopy out and they block the growth of that scrubby stuff. So even though these are the same size territories, there's a huge difference with the quality of the territory. Some species do better in edge, others need core areas. So when developers are saying, hey, we're going to develop this and put a subdivision in, and we're going to keep 50 hectares of land available for habitat, if they're doing it like number 1, you're going to lose a lot of species because of edge effect. So that plays a big role. The shape of the community influences the characteristics of the community. So you'll have a completely different diverse biodiversity in number 1 versus number 2. So things to keep in mind when we get into conservation and restoration and those ideas as well. So, all right, now something to remember. Communities are constantly changing. They're constantly in transition. No community is locked and stable and never going to have any kind of disturbance, disruption, or change. It's just, do they have resilience? Do they have stability? Depends on the community and can determine the outcome of the change. So when we talk about communities in transition or change, we talk about ecological succession. That is just the change in communities over time. Now, a community will go through primary succession if it is starting from ground zero, no life. So imagine lava flow coming down a volcano, destroying every single thing. There's no life there. Now you have primary succession. Species will start to come into your community and create diversity. The first species in are known as the pioneers. They pave the way. They set the tone and they say, okay, we can survive in this community. We can survive on this lava flow, and we'll start to break it down. We'll start to change the composition of the lava and turn it into organic material and make it higher quality, start to build soil, produce shade, trap moisture, and then you get other species coming in that can then survive, and you start building your biodiversity. When we experience secondary succession, life exists. Usually it's in the soil. like a seed bank. Okay, there's a flood came through, wiped out most of a community, drowned out most stuff. Floodwaters receded, and life sprang back up. Imagine a fire going through a forest. Doesn't kill everything. There's still soil there. There might be trees that survive the fire. Life exists, but a lot of it got knocked backwards or decreased in population. Some may have even gone extinct or been killed because of the event, but there's life there when we talk about secondary succession. And what they're doing is they're trying to increase diversity, build up the biodiversity within the community. Potentially, those communities will move towards what we call a climax community. So a climax community is a community that is at its maximum complexity and stability that is possible. So it has the greatest biodiversity that it can reach, and the community is as stable as it can be, and everything looks good. In the US, we have very little of this anymore. About the only true climax communities exist in the Pacific Northwest. The Shawnee National Forest, beautiful forests, most of that was planted back in the 1930s. So it's 80, 85 years old. It's old, but it's not old as a community. There are trees in the Shawnee that are hundreds of years old, but the community does not go back 300, 400, 500 years. The community goes back about 80 years, if that. So communities are trying to move towards this climax status, and it's a constant, let's move forward, jump backwards, move forward, we get knocked backwards. So they're moving, if they start here, and this is the climax point, they're going, and then maybe an event occurs, and they go, now we're back here. And then they build up in diversity, and they do this. And then a fire comes in and it goes, knocks you back to here. So they're constantly doing this. It's a constant, can we keep moving forward? We get knocked back. Can we eventually reach this spot over here? It depends. Depends on the community itself and how far it goes forward, how far it gets knocked backwards. Lots of variables in that equation. But here's an example of climax community, or primary succession trying to move towards climax. You got bare rock, you get lichens, mosses, things that can grow in poor conditions. Those are your pioneers. They set the stage. They create community abiotic conditions that enable things like grasses and herbs and these little shrubs and even tree seedlings to germinate. Those continue to change that community's abiotic conditions and move towards these bigger trees like aspens and spruces and pines that, again, change the community to make it possible for the white spruce, the balsam fir, paper birch, etc. to take over. And the irony is each group before usually gets outcompeted by the new group coming in. But if that new group gets knocked out, if those aspen get at that fourth level, get cut down, it may allow herbs and grasses to now regain a foothold in the community. So again, it's a continuous movement, back and forth within communities. They're not static, unchanging things. That's the fun part of ecology and environmental science and biology, is watching these things go back and forth and back and forth. And believe it or not, disturbance can actually be a good thing. Fire is good in a moderated level. Flooding every so often, that can be a good thing because it brings in nutrients, it brings in new seeds, it sometimes drowns out things you don't want. So disturbance is not always a bad, evil thing. It can be good in some instances and some levels. So, all right. Last thing, invasives. These are not good. Invasive species leads to community change. Usually it's for the detriment of the community. That plant there, honeysuckle. Honeysuckle was brought, there are native species of honeysuckle. So let's start with that. There's an Asian species of honeysuckle that was brought to the US and intentionally planted to help control erosion. This stuff has spread across the entire Midwest and is destroying the forests of the Midwest. It is horrible. It chokes out the undergrowth, doesn't allow the new generation of trees to germinate, and when the big adult trees die off, there's no replacement for the natives because the new ones don't have a chance. This stuff will actually leaf out earliest in the spring. So it's putting leaves out sometimes in February and March before all of our natives do. And then it keeps its leaves. I've seen leaves on honeysuckle into November. It's like the last thing in the forest that still have green leaves. That's usually the easy way to identify honeysuckle. In November, everything else has dropped its leaves. Honeysuckle's still green. So it starts before and finishes after everything else that's native, which gives it a huge competitive advantage. And that is changing the entire forest ecosystem in the Midwest. That little insect there, emerald ash borer, wiping out ash trees across the entire eastern United States, and it's in the Midwest. It's in Illinois. If you have an ash tree, it's probably not going to be alive in 5 or 10 years because of these suckers. Brought over unintentionally. There's no natural predator, so we have no way to control its population. Its population grows unchecked and is just absolutely destroying the ecosystems here. The ash trees. So you take out that ash tree, think about how many other species are going to be impacted and the ripple effect. So we need to be very, very conscious of invasive species, non-natives, when we talk about restoration and ecosystems and things like that. We want to identify what are known as endemic species. Those are ones native to that given environment, and make sure we're very aware of how to maintain natives and not bring in invasives. You'll also hear them called alien species, non-natives, etc. Same thing. So, all right, so we want to be careful with that and make sure we can do everything possible to help maintain normal ecological interactions within ecosystems so those ecosystems can continue working through the successionary process.